Good evening.
Good evening.
I hope everybody is doing well. I'm Mark Sanders, professor here in the Department of English, and I have the honor and privilege of introducing tonight's writer, artist, guest, sister, Professor Azareen Vliet Oloomi. Before I get to the formal introduction, I want to give you the spiel I gave you last week. Those of you who heard it last week, you're just going to have to hear it again. Those of you who did not, I can take this off for a moment. Those of you who did not, hopefully you're in for a treat. In addition to being a professor here in the English department, I am the director of the new Initiative on Race and Resilience. This is an organization, a community in its most ideal form of scholars, students, artists, and activists, all committed to the redress of systemic racism and to the support of communities of color. Thinking spatially, we're global in our scope and critical approach, both comparative and interdisciplinary. If your work addresses issues of race and inequality and/or communities of color, please look at our website, get in touch with me, and think about being affiliated with the Initiative on Race and Resilience. If you would like for me to come to your class and talk about the Initiative on Race, please get in touch with me. I would be thrilled to come to your class and talk to undergraduates. We think of our mission in terms of three foci, in terms of research, education, and community outreach. And those are the ways in which we try to manifest or make real this confrontation with systemic racism in support of communities of color. One of the ways that we try to link all three is through the arts. We think of the arts as the best way to keep alive or to be fully responsive to what we see as the critical tension at the heart of the concept of race. Race as both a means of domination and exploitation, and race as a site of identity, recuperation, and resilience. And so our first initiative around hiring was to hire, with English and creative writing, a writer. We thought a writer, it turned out to be two writers working in this area. Dion Bremeyer, who is right here in front. So we're absolutely thrilled to have both of them. So two, we partner consistently with creative writing, largely through Professor Azareen Vliet Oloomi, who is on the board of, the board of directors. This is not going to work. Who's on our board of directors. And so let me move now to the formal introduction. In 2012, when Professor Vliet Oloomi's first novel, Kroc Healer, came out, she was a very promising and up-and-coming writer. She subsequently won the 2015 Whiting Writers Award. She was named a National Book Foundation 5 under 35 honoree. She received the MacDowell Fellowship and a Fulbright Fellowship in Fiction to Catalonia. And at the same time, she published in the New York Times, the Paris Review, Granta, Guernica, and among many other venues. Then she published Call Me Zebra in 2018, which won the Faulkner Award. The Guardian ranked her novel #2 in the top 10 books about roots and home, a ranking higher than Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon, that came in #6, higher than V.S. Naipaul's House for Mr. Biswas, came in #9, and higher than Alex Haley's Roots, that came in 10. Thus, with the critical success of Call Me Zebra, Professor Vliet Oloomi was no longer up and coming, but a literary force, an artist in full command of her artistry, making an indelible imprint on contemporary fiction, an artist shaping the agenda and the language of literature yet to come. Fast on the heels of Call Me Libra, a novel featuring a peripatetic young woman attempting to decipher the meaning of her father's life and death, and necessarily the meaning of her own life, Professor Vliet Oloomi now presents us with Savage Tongues, in which a more mature woman leaves home to confront the trauma of her childhood and first love affair 20 years prior, an affair begun with a rape and defined by abuse and domination. Both novels offer us female agents determined to make sense of the world writ large in their own circumstances, their loves, their communities, their sense of well-being, on their own terms, terms that are almost always at odds with the dominant prescriptions of gender, ethnicity, region, or religion. The two novels share a pressing set of concerns. This is not exhaustive by any means. Female agency, the centrality of interior psychic spaces, itineracy and emotional growth, the haunting absence of fathers, and the charged relationship between trauma and creativity, or abuse and pleasure. Savage Tongues presents us with Aresu, a 37-year-old woman returning to Marbella, a small seaside town in southern Spain, not far from the Strait of Gibraltar, that razor-thin divide between West and East, Christian and Muslim, saved and damned. Accompanied by her closest friend, Ellie, Aresu returns to the apartment where so much of her first love affair took place with Omar, a man of 40, her rapist, her tormentor, and guide to an erotic life. The return occasions a review of memories, the revisiting of her relationships with her father, her brother, her mother, and Ellie, who grew up in an Orthodox Jewish family in Israel, but was ostracized for her sympathy for Palestinians and her criticism of the occupation. In other words, Savage Tongues confronts us with overlapping personal and historical traumas, the ways in which the trauma of the Holocaust, the occupation of Palestine, the Lebanese Civil War, all manifest on a personal/psychic register as sexual abuse, abandonment, and alienation. Indeed, Jane Wallace of the Asian Review of Books writes, quote, "By turns brilliant, erotic, and piercing, this third novel shines a new light into how historical oppression, both at a personal and societal level, continues to dominate our present-day thinking. Ostensibly a dissection of an exploitative relationship, the novel quickly broadens into a wide-ranging examination and skewering of master narratives around race, gender, sexuality, and religion, which dictate the way we live now." End quote. Yet while the geopolitics shaping Aresu's life are omnipresent, the drama of the novel is intensely interior and personal. Professor Vliet Oloomi insists that we as readers inhabit the space of Aresu's psyche, where layers upon layers of trauma press in and down, making for a cramped, nearly asphyxiating space where the immediacy and incessancy of trauma assault the reader just as Aresu's apartment assaults her. In this sense, Savage Tongues is a palpably nervous and uncomfortable book. Our heroine is both a victim of rape and actively pursues the love and affection of her rapist. Omar is both sexual predator and product of the Orientalist gaze, and thus is in some ways doomed to pass on the violence at the heart of the colonial project shaping Lebanon, his homeland. As readers, we are compelled to inhabit a world of moral ambiguity where we too are implicated through our silences, associations, our willingness to transmit our personal traumas. We are too complicit in our own subjugation and necessarily in the subjugation of others. Towards the end of the novel, Aresu reflects, quote, "I had created language, this language as an offering bestowed to others, an offering of the simplest truth of all, that Omar and I and my brother, my mother, my brother, my father, his mother and father, and so on and so forth, every one of us are all caught up in the vortex of cruelty together. There were no victims, there were no victors, no victims. We were caught in a web we had woven together. We are all of us implicated, all of us responsible. Ellipsis. And looking one last time at the Alhambra in all its glory and beauty past, and the gallows pole that had been used to annihilate that past, looking at the tool of death superimposed on this architecture that so thoroughly celebrated life, I thought, isn't it possible to transform the cruelty that had connected Omar and me back into love? In another sense, Savage Tongue is a quest in the epic tradition, a knight errant, if you will, but not a quest to conquer or consume, but a journey inward toward the self, toward community and psychic wholeness. A journey propelled by the alchemy of Professor Vliet Oloomi's intoxicating prose. Aresu rediscovers a healing love that was always there. Ellie's steadfast hand, free of judgment or violence. Like Sula's love for Nell, or Phoebe's love for Janie, this community of women beckons us all to imagine love unfettered by violence. In this regard, Professor Vliet Oloomi offers us the most compelling kind of art that provokes, antagonizes, critiques, and finally points towards alternatives at the very frontier of imagination. Please join me in welcoming Professor Azareen van der Vliet.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out this evening, and thank you, Mark, for that just incredible introduction. Just being in conversation over the last few years has been really remarkable. Yeah, it's really been transformative for me, and actually a lot of our conversations, maybe you didn't know it, but were very helpful to me in writing the book, so just gather myself for a second. So, as Mark mentioned, the novel follows two women, Arzu and Ellie, and they go on what they call recovery journeys with one another. And one of them is the journey that you mentioned, which is the return to Marbella, Spain. And woven into that narrative is a journey that they took together previous to that one to Israel and Palestine. So the novel will kind of move pretty fluidly back and forth between these spaces, just so you know. It was still early in the season. After lying empty and exposed to the tides of winter, the streets were renewed by the arrival of foreign tourists, Arab sheikhs, Spaniards who kept summer apartments by the sea. The local shopkeepers had stocked and decorated their shelves, thrown their polished windows open to let in the warm air, which trembled with the prospect of money. The early summer light was brilliant, luminous. The palms and aloes with their green arching leaves thick with water, the white stucco walls of the homes set squarely against one another, the thick papery bougainvillea that crawled across the city's surfaces like mouths painted rouge, like kisses turned toward the vivid blue of the sky. All of it screamed yes to life. We made our way through the crowd. We maneuvered our suitcases around elderly women dressed in modest pale peaches and purples and sequined flat shoes, around children playfully walking their dogs. Parents trailed languorously behind, occasionally yelling words of caution at their children, who were full of zest for the lazy pleasures of summer. We walked alongside the old straw-colored walls of the city, puckered with cavernous holes that resisted the bright, eager light. We stopped a few times, breathless, and set down our suitcases to listen to the cawing of the crows, the whining of the seagulls. Eventually, all that remained of our journey was to walk across the promenade that ran parallel to the old Arab walls, walk across the cut granite pavement, the pink and gray stone shimmering in the gleam of the sun. I felt heavy. Across the way, the light seemed to have been sucked from the sky. Darkness abided over our building. It sat on a narrow, crooked street in cold shade. As I took in its smog-stained walls, its blistering paint and cracked terraces artlessly stacked on top of one another, I felt a dreadful stirring. An acidic terror stung my throat. It was a feeling that had stirred in me then, too, during that most terrible summer of my life, its darkest dawn, when the hours had passed under the Spanish sky, with no one watching over me. I retreated to the living room window and leaned my head out to take in the fresh air. Below, I saw the vendors preparing to close their shops, retrieving the leeks and oranges and celery that stood in piles on the sidewalk, and thought to myself, Omar knew all of the mountain roads. He knew the mountains like a guerrilla fighter. He lived off those mountains, taking people on excursions, hunting birds and rabbits and wild boars. He knew every rock, every tree. I had been so skinny then, so tiny, like that wild boar he'd captured, with her spotted back and coarse hair and blinking eyes, her small, raw hooves. I felt an unbearable ache in my heart at the thought of her. A dog came bounding down the promenade, answering to a whistle that seemed to come from one of the vendors beneath the building. I heard the metal shutters of stores opening and closing. A young woman was making her way up the promenade, her tanned, muscular legs shining in the copper light of the descending sun. I had also been strong then, I considered, wiry, perfectly capable of keeping up, despite my incessant smoking habit. I'd swim across the lakes, leaving Omar heaving behind on the rocky shores. I remembered him placing his hand on my hip bones. I remembered him lifting hot sand from the beach and pouring it onto my belly, saying all the while that I needed to eat more. I couldn't help but feel a pang of nostalgia for him, a feeling that disturbed me greatly because it suggested that I missed him on some deep physiological level I could neither justify nor control. The girl disappeared from view, and for a moment the street lay empty, silent. The cut granite stones of the promenade looked dazzling beneath the sky. I watched 3 old men come up the road dressed in brown slacks and button-down shirts, wearing espadrilles, leaning into their canes. I pictured my father, alone at 14, his features swollen as they were preparing to find their final shape, his face red from the cold ocean winds, his small gray eyes raw from the searing salt of the stormy water, the damp air, his back to Great Britain, his neck and shoulders tense from the absence of his own parents, his stomach turning on the high seas. And then I thought of myself at 17, alone in the seaside apartment. My father must have thought, what a luxury, what a life this child of mine has. Ellie reappeared in the corridor. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry too, I told her. It was my fault. I shouldn't have been so abrasive. You don't need to apologize, she conceded. It's just hard to guess what you're feeling sometimes. I gave Ellie a knowing look, then walked past her into the bathroom. I needed to wash my face. The bathroom, narrow, rectangular, windowless, smelled damp with mold. The mirror had lost its shine. I looked at myself. I looked eaten with exhaustion. I remembered seeing my face staring back at me helplessly from that mirror before, my mouth stretched into a painful grimace. I'd been hungry. I thought of all the figs Omar and I had eaten that summer, all the times we'd pulled to the side of the mountain roads on his Ducati and removed our helmets to pluck fruit from the trees. We'd fed them to each other. We'd been happy at the expense of my future self. I wondered if that younger version of myself had known the power she'd ultimately wield, if she'd known then that I'd be accountable to her for the rest of my life, pushing myself to my limits, trying to retrieve her from the abysmal well she'd found herself in. I wanted to tell Ellie that after the first terrible time, when Omar had forced himself on me, trapped me the way he'd trapped that wild boar and had his way. I'd gone back for more until it became the most natural thing in the world. I wanted to tell her that my memories of the time I'd spent with Omar outside of the bedroom felt nebulous and disjointed, that I needed to remember more than the earthy taste of Omar's body. But I couldn't find my voice, and besides, Ellie was already intimately familiar with my story, and in any case, she had stories of her own. She had witnessed firsthand the power sex has to destroy, to decimate, to stifle. She'd left home at 15, unable to withstand the severity of her parents, the surveillance culture of the wider Orthodox community, the oppression bearing down on her body, the covenants policing her sex, curbing her desires. She'd lived on the streets for a year, sleeping under bridges, huddled together with other runaways, relying on strangers' leftovers, which she stole off the tables at sidewalk cafes. She moved in with a man halfway through the year, an older man in his 20s, far more experienced than she was. He'd insisted that in exchange for a warm bed and shelter, she had to sleep with all of his friends, and she'd done it. She had removed herself from her body. She had floated above herself or stood beside herself and watched this other curly-haired girl twist her body to conform to the needs of others. She told me that a few times this other girl, had lifted her face as if she were searching for Ellie, but that her gaze had been vacant, that she'd stared emptily at something behind Ellie, that after that, Ellie had removed herself altogether from the room. I'd been remorseless toward myself, she'd said to me once. She'd spent years in therapy sewing together all of her dissonant parts. She'd become convinced that the Israelis' unacknowledged violence against the Palestinians, the repressed fear and guilt and grief of protecting one's life at the expense of another's, was erroneously expressed through sexual aggression. Sex, Ellie had come to believe, had become a way for the lost youth of that dense, troubled land to work through the cycle of violence and inherited fear that had shaped their lives, entrapped them. As Ellie walked into the bathroom and stood behind me, her plastic peach-colored makeup bag in hand, I remembered that we'd walked past the cafes that she'd stolen cold French fries and half-eaten falafel from, and that we'd realized then that anything that has the ability to create life has the capacity to exterminate it in equal or greater measure. We had talked about the fact that sex could simultaneously create life and extinguish it, that people were either in denial of its power or terrified of it, that the closest Western society had come to acknowledging its influence was its romanticization of motherhood and procreation, a facet of femininity neither one of us was particularly interested in. I took in Ellie's face in the mirror. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't rise up through my chest. There was something in my throat holding them down. I could feel the accumulated pressure of all the tears I hadn't shed. Some understanding was taking shape, that the constriction in my throat was likely a result of my silence, a silence that had become habitual, that had shut me down, cut me off from myself. I had tried my whole life to recover my relationship to language. I had tried through writing to arrive at the totalizing quality of torture, its capacity to destroy speech, to exterminate the contents of one's consciousness, to turn reality itself, all of the concrete objects of one's life, walls, underwear, couches, into participants in one's destruction. But I wasn't sure that I'd found adequate language for my pain. I wasn't even sure that a structure built of words was capable of containing it. I entered the shop and asked for Rosario. The man who was minding the shop looked at me with expert eyes, then looked down at his desk, which was crowded with objects: salt shakers shaped like tuna fruit, tiny olive and almond and salt platters with flowers painted on their glazed yellow surfaces. Slowly, without raising his gaze from his desk, he told me that Rosario was his mother, that she'd passed away nearly 10 years prior, that the shop was his now. There was a grandfather clock standing against the wall behind him. The clock was wheezing like a pair of lungs. I stared at its swinging pendulum. It seemed to be whispering something to me. I felt a hot breath on my neck. Omar. There it was. His name trembling on my lips, more powerful than I was. "Are you looking to buy something?" Rosario's son asked. "Yes," I said. "Yes." Nervously moving about the store, I picked out a candle holder, a beautiful centerpiece delicately carved and painted a regal blue. I told him that I was looking to light some candles, paid him, and quietly left. Outside, I sat on a bench. The ache in my stomach had worsened. The pain had become unbearable. I felt as though someone had turned up the pressure in my gut. I felt ready to burst. I needed to take a moment to breathe before walking the rest of the way to the apartment. There were two men standing a few meters behind me. I directed my attention to them in order to distract myself from the tears working their way out of my body, tears I was afraid would be toxic. I swallowed hard. I shoved everything that was rising up in me as far down as I could. Listen to their conversation, I told myself, and my old habit of obedience kicked in. They were talking about women, about marriage. I heard one of them say that he preferred his women to be ugly because the ugly ones made more competent housewives. They're better cooks and don't complain when it's time to mop the floors and de-web the ceiling. Besides, he added, he could always go down to the beach and stare at the foreign women, their bodies overflowing with sexual offerings, their habits and tastes indiscriminate. Obscene women, he said, women who spread their legs for anybody. The other man laughed and clapped encouragingly. What happened to women cutting their hair short when they got married and letting their waists thicken and being happy in their house slippers and aprons? The first man asked. They used to go down to the butcher looking like that, and they all want to be appreciated now. They want us to cup their breasts as if they were pears carved from gold by the hands of Jesus, he exclaimed happily. Forget it. Give me an ugly wife or nothing. His friend went on clapping, applauding what he kept referring to as a timely sermon. It dawned on me then why all the women called one another Wapa here. It was a code of solidarity, a rallying cry against the abuse of language catapulted at them by certain men. It was a collective affirmation of their dignity. I'd closed my eyes. When I opened them, I saw that Rosario's son was standing before me. He was holding out his arm. He said, "You forgot your change." He opened his palm to show me a 5-euro bill. I took the bill and thanked him. He walked away, dragging his feet, head hanging, his eyes on the ground. A man who was afraid, who had likely always been afraid of making eye contact with women. There are all kinds of men in this world, I thought, all kinds. As soon as he was out of sight, I began shaking. I tried to push the surge of tears back down. I swallowed, I begged, I negotiated with the heavens, but nothing worked. And soon I had given in to a long, bereft fit of weeping. It hurt. My throat and the backs of my lids hurt. I cried until my head throbbed. My lungs were exhausted and sore, my lips raw, but I couldn't stop. It was as if a great flood were moving through me, a terrible earthquake, a shifting of the fault lines in the oceanic depths of my life. I thought of Ellie, reminded myself that I wasn't alone. I just had to get myself to the apartment. I just had to make my way to her. I got up and walked downhill through the old quarter. I could hardly see straight. My vision was blurred with tears that were collecting faster than I could unload them. I walked a narrow street flanked by the puckered walls of the Arab ruins. Great tufts of lavender and capers were growing out of the cracks and seams. I stopped halfway down the road and clung to one of those bushes. I nearly yanked it out of that great ancient wall. Those stones that were as rough as sandpaper. The street was deserted. There was no one in sight. I heard my mother's voice. I heard her utter that saying she had so often repeated, "God is our only witness." I didn't even know if I believed there was a God hovering in the heavens, crowning our heads. I couldn't wait to get home to Ellie. I thought of the healing power of friendship as I made my way down that empty street, a street as old as time. Friendship, I thought, is a form of witness. She had received my testimony. She had held it with tenderness and love. She had taken care with my story. I could feel myself, my whole body rushing toward her. I thought of her contagious laughter, how we doubled over laughing in the middle of an empty maze of streets behind the Damascus Gate in Jerusalem, the air thick with the smell of incense and the sound of murmured prayers, because I, who did not even know if I believed in God, had been turned away from the Al-Aqsa Mosque that morning by 2 Israeli soldiers in green fatigues and combat boots, bullet belts strapped to their chests. "You're not a Muslim," they'd said in unison, as if channeling God herself. I was wearing a full hijab. I'd wanted to go into the mosque, to pray, to press my forehead against its well-worn floors as a way to be near my mother and her parents, to salute their deep religiosity despite my own confused ambivalence. I had been raised, after all, to greet God every morning, to thank God every evening. "Recite the Ashura," the soldiers commanded, stroking their guns. And I had. I stood there with a fire in my eyes, holding back my pain, hardening my face so it wouldn't show my sorrow or my anger. I recited the verses. I recited them for myself. I recited them for the soldiers, for the collective humiliation that we had been forced to perform. For the Palestinians whose relationship to the divine was eclipsed, a form of psychological and spiritual torture not to be allowed to access the sacred sites of one's culture. And as I recited the Ashura, in that moment, against all odds, I had suddenly believed there was a God. I had felt heard, accompanied by an invisible fleet of bodies that had gathered at my back to support me. I was sure my ancestors were standing behind me, placing each verse of the Quran in my mouth to be uttered. Halfway through the prayer, the soldiers grew impatient and let me in. And my privilege, in comparison to the Palestinians to whom this land and its sites belonged, was not lost on me. I almost turned away, but the soldiers waved me through the arched passageway with their guns and a nod of their heads, and I walked, aware that I was a target, that all my life there had been a gun pointed at my back. I walked through the courtyard of olive trees, beneath a blue sun, so bright it appeared to have been lit from below, past men and women dressed in simple robes, toward the golden dome of the mosque, and left my shoes at the door. I met Ellie at the gate after that. I told her what had happened, and we'd begun to laugh. "You're not a Muslim," we kept repeating to each other, laughing our hearts out at the preposterous request that I justify my humanity. "You're not a Muslim." It was an absurd utterance, a statement that ushered hatred into the world, a statement designed to remind me that I was under surveillance, that I, a potential purveyor of future violence, needed to be monitored, controlled. How, Ellie and I had wondered, laughing out our pained hearts, were we expected to carve out lives for ourselves amid all of that suspicion and hatred? How were we meant to believe in God, and what would that belief absolve us of? We had treated our friendship as sacred, as a kind of religion. Was that not then a manifestation of devotion? Was love and laughter not devotional? Laugh, my mother had said to me as a young child. Laugh as a way of being close to the grace of God. That was long before this story had unfolded. As I emerged from the street and looked up at our building, I remembered how Ellie and I stood in the shade of those ancient walls and given ourselves over to laughter. We'd barely been able to contain ourselves. Tears had streamed down our faces. We'd been on the verge of having to urinate, folded over, giggling in heaves between breaths, everything rushing out of us in one mad, delirious stream. Had we been crying then? Crying together through our laughter, articulating side by side our profound sense of loss? Had we been asking the universe not to turn its back on us? Had we been asking God to kneel down as our witness? Stop. happy to take questions or.
I didn't know if you wanted me to feel.
Oh, no. And thank you again for that beautiful introduction. I could stop writing after that. It would probably be better for me and everyone else. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has questions about process or the book itself. Or we can go downstairs and have a drink. Either way. Valerie.
Thank you. Beautiful, beautiful reading, and Mark did such a wonderful reading of the book beforehand that I felt well prepared to enter. I've been hearing about this book for a long while now, but I was not prepared for that last passage you read. It's so unusual to hear that kind of frank description of religious belief in a narrative. Could you talk a little bit about how you steeled yourself or not to write a passage like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm really interested in the sacred and the profane, and the book really is very, like Mark said, so uncomfortable to read in certain moments, and was so uncomfortable to write, particularly around the kind of very disturbing erotics of the novel. And there's the line that Mark quoted at the end about what does it take to kind of transform cruelty back into love, which is that kind of transformative act that takes so long to do, and it's internal and it's private, right? It doesn't often happen. I mean, sometimes we have moments in the collective environment or socially where there's a transformation, right, of consciousness, but it's usually very quiet work. And I think that the characters are seeped in religion, right? They're seeped in these cultures that are at odds with one another through religious conflict or political or geopolitical conflict. And we're both raised as believers, right? Believe far more than Arzu. And that is exactly what endangers them to some extent with the sexual abuse piece for both of them, because in the act of leaving home and kind of, they disown their family before their families disown them, right? They make themselves incredibly vulnerable to being targets of sexual abuse because they were raised in a condition where nobody taught them anything about their bodies. If anything, they were taught not to talk or think or touch their bodies, right? So, and then deeply patriarchal social codes. So it wasn't difficult to link, and this is a hard thing to do because you don't want to further kind of stereotype religions, because this is one part, it's one piece. These are two humans, two individual stories, right? So yeah, I just couldn't separate them. And I think for me, that move is like a move that Beckett makes. Like, I feel like there are writers, or Kafka, like always reaching for the celestial from this very absurd space. It's one of my favorite moments in the book, actually, and it's where the two journeys really collapse with one another, because she's in Spain walking through Arab ruins, right, and thinking historically about all these interconnections. Thank you for a great question.
Yeah. Thanks, that was beautiful. And just thinking about Poem Zebra and the role naming plays in it, and I was wondering about the protagonist names. Arzu, right, means desire, I think, right?
Yeah, like wish.
Yeah, in Turkish it means desire. So,
yeah.
And then Ellie, I don't know if there's sort of something there with the naming practices, or was it random?
Ellie is like a typical kind of Jewish Israeli name that I really love, and I love the sound of their names together. So Arzu's name was more intentional than Ellie's, but I just love like the openness of the vowel sounds in their names and the way that they rhyme with one another, and they're so different, right? And like everything in their world is set up for them not to be friends, but they just kind of fall in love with each other. And one of the things is like, this is not a story about Omar, right? He's kind of background noise to some degree. This is a story about like true female friendship and the enduring and lasting qualities of female friendship and queer friendship and interreligious friendship.
Yeah, the names go really well together.
Yeah, no one could pronounce Arzu's name. They'd be like Arzu, Azaru, all of it.
I love it.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Oh, there's more questions. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. I'd like to just sort of ask, maybe in the writing process, how you approach writing maybe some of the erotic stuff or the erotic passages. I think for young writers, it can be really easy to err on the side of either like being too crass or too like afraid to go there.
Sure.
And if there were like maybe certain writers that you were paying attention to.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not easy. And I feel like, especially as women writers, it's not easy because, and I feel like probably for male writers, it's not easy too, because the whole like lineage of writing about sex from a masculine gaze is limited too, right? And so if you want to do justice to it, there aren't a ton of models. But I was in the feminist tradition reading Marguerite Duras, and reading this Egyptian woman, Nawal al-Sadawi, Women at Point Zero, who's just so explicit and really gets at the heart of like the agency and patriarchy. And then Garth Greenwell, I think we were talking about him in class. We were like, well, once you're Garth Greenwell, like, there's not anything you feel bad about writing because he's so much more uncensored and such an exquisite writer. And then Hervé Guibert, Eileen Miles, sort of Kathy Acker, like the writers who are just fearless. I always think like go to them to read and learn, and then you can peel back. Like maybe that's not where you want to be, but just keep seeing who's out there on the frontiers writing about sex in complicated and complicating ways, right? Or the body, period. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about like, yes, both emotional and kind of traditional like research that you do?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so this is a novel that for me is like emotionally truthful, right? But there's so much in it that's also very dramatized. It's a novel. But I do rely on family history, on oral histories that I've heard. I rely on just, I don't know, like the subtext and conversation where people reveal so much more than they think they're revealing. And if you ask the right question and you lean in, people want to share, right? Like that's the thing that I feel like writers, people are always telling you stuff, but it's because you notice and you take care of what you notice, hopefully, right? So there's a lot of just what it means to be open in the world, which is not easy, to be like on the receiving end. But then there's also research. So for this book, I was actually reading a lot about language and torture and like how torture affects your ability to speak. So I was reading this great book by Elaine Scarry, The Body and Pain, and then this wonderful scholar, Kathy Carruth, who writes about literature in the ashes of history, and Judith Butler and Maggie Nelson. So I actually read like criticism, which I think can be really generative. But then James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, and Sula, those were the two books that were like, I kept just, going to them for courage and to learn, like it's an education to read those two writers for sure. So yeah, lots of walking around the world, like absorbing. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could talk about the process of writing something that spans across a large swath of time and working with a narrative that deals with reflection. I guess something that I noticed was how much attention to detail there is to physical structures and how that kind of serves as like a trigger point for certain memories or experiences. But yeah, I would just love to hear you talking about writing about a huge chunk of time in a narrative.
Yeah, for sure. So I kind of think about all these spaces and time periods as being nested inside one another. And so Israel and Palestine fits into the narrative because both Muslims and Jews were persecuted simultaneously. And a lot of what's happening right now in the Middle East can be traced back to medieval Iberia. It's not something we think about or talk about very much, right? We can barely deal with like the last 20 years. So just doing that kind of historical research, I wasn't writing a historical novel, so I thought about structuring it as the Russian nesting dolls, where you have like the apartment, and then within the apartment the memories of the past, and then when they're walking around the city, that's when the memories of Israel and Palestine get triggered by particular architectures, and that helped me to organize it somewhat. But there is a tension in the novel between the fact that the novel takes place in 7 days, literally, it's just 7 days. Most of the time they're in the apartment, and what you're reliving in those 7 days is roughly 25 years of two people's personal histories, right? Which are tied in with political discourse. So I honestly, I don't know if it's like successful or not to do it that way, but it was the only way that I could map what I wanted to map, which was that these wounds are not just about intimate violence. Like, these wounds are about the entire situation, right? The ongoingness of it all. So it's, yeah, just as much as you can pin it down to physical space, then you can give the reader somewhere to rest, hopefully.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all for coming out.